Good morning. I grew up in a patriotic family, and I'm proud to be an American. My grandfathers fought in World War II, my uncles fought in Korea and were drafted for Vietnam. Even one of my aunts was in the military. When I was little, my brother and I would dress up in my grandfather's green army uniform and play G.I. Joe. We learned to shoot guns at a young age, and after watching Red Dawn at my cousin's house, we were constantly on guard for a Russian invasion. I knew to take my cowboy hat off and stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner. Every Memorial Day would find us cleaning up our family members' graves at the local cemetery. The highlight of each summer was going to the county fair and watching the rodeo. I visited the state capitol and the U.S. Mint in Denver, and I'd even been to a few neighboring states. So I thought it was pretty American until I left the country. When I left the U.S., I became much more American than I had ever been before. That little blue passport, that little book of privilege, it grants unimaginable power and insight, a chance to go anywhere, to see anything. It gave me the opportunity to really see myself and my country for the first time. Never before had I looked at America from the outside or from the perspective of an outsider. It was then that I saw America with new eyes. That's freedom and privilege. To be able to leave your country just for fun, just to learn more about yourself and your homeland, to venture out in the world and both be welcome back and to want to come back. That's fortunate. You can't really know America until you leave it, just like a fish doesn't really know water until it's in the air. Until I left this country, I didn't really understand or appreciate just what America is and what it isn't. And my first time outside of the country, I was definitely a fish out of water. All of a sudden, I had a shockingly different perspective of my language, my culture, my government, our food, my country. It was all different, all so foreign. And what a valuable lesson that has been. Every time I leave, I learn more. The world has taught me a lot about America and being American. As a junior in high school in Europe, I didn't really know about political systems or our democracy. But when my teacher convinced someone at the doors of the European Parliament to let us in, I had my first glimpse at another form of government. He said we were the sons and daughters of important Americans. Imagine that. Important people. I didn't tell him I'd sold a horse to help pay for the trip. My dad worked for the government. My mom was a school teacher. We weren't important people. Later, I studied political science in college, but I didn't really understand what a democratic republic was until I lived in post-socialist East Europe, amidst all those communist artifacts. And though I'd never missed an election, I didn't fully appreciate the power of the vote until I lived in a dictatorship where the president had won every election by a landslide since 1986. I didn't fully appreciate my passport until it was taken away one night by a grumpy immigration officer in Addis Ababa. That felt like the longest 30 hours of my life. But I got that little blue book back after I bought a plane ticket on the next flight back to the U.S. I didn't really think about the American genocide until I visited the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda and saw our genocide listed as one of the worst in history, even though I grew up next to a Native American reservation. I didn't really think about American imperialism until I visited the War Remnants Museum and former U.S. Embassy in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and I crawled through the Cu Chi tunnels to look out at still visible bomb craters more than 20 years later. I took the English language for granted until I taught it to eager Ecuadorians, hoping for their chance to use it to work in America. And when I argued with my Bulgarian colleagues about whether the word draggle was commonly used and appropriate for their website, I hadn't pondered why the U.S. never reconciled with African Americans until I heard Archbishop Desmond Tutu speak about his work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Cape Town just 4 years after apartheid ended. Slavery gained a whole new meaning for me when I sat in the underground slave chambers amidst piles of iron shackles at the slave market in Zanzibar. I didn't really think about stability and security until I got in trouble for taking pictures of still fresh Civil War memorials in northern Uganda, where I was working with people struggling to rebuild their lives after war. Or looking up at bullet-strewn walls and worrying about landmines as we walked around Sarajevo, seeing the bombed-out embassy in Belgrade, gazing at the repaired city of Dubrovnik, I gained a whole new appreciation for what I haven't experienced. So I'm lucky to be American and to get to know America from the inside and the outside.
Who are we? Tomorrow is the 4th of July, when we celebrate the creation of our country and us as a people. And we just celebrated Juneteenth, marking the date when we were all a free people. So, who are we? First, let me note that I spent my entire adult life as a university professor, giving lectures to rooms full of eager and sometimes not so eager college students. So my style today may inevitably be more professorial than ministerial. Fair warning. About us as a people, news commentators stress our differences. They talk about red states, blue states, but in reality, most are purple states. If someone wins an election with 55% of the vote, it is declared a landslide. But that means that 45% of the population voted for the other guy. Most of the time, the difference is only 3 or 4%. Just look at our own state of Oregon. It is true that the more urban western part of the state tends to be more liberal, and the sparsely populated east of the Cascades is more conservative, but elections are often close in both areas. So, as we mark this holiday tomorrow, I thought I would spend my time this morning reflecting on America and Americans. The last several years have been tumultuous, and the last couple of weeks have been tumultuous as well. We constantly hear about our failures. Economic inequality, political extremism dominates the media conversation, racism, hate crimes, the appalling number of mass killings over the last few months. Commentators talk about the death of democracy. Our country seems to be changing, and often it seems for the worse. This morning I want to pause and consider some of what I think is at the root of this turmoil. An unrealistic yearning for a remembered time when things were better, and concern about the unknowns that come with change. And then some thoughts about some positives that can come with change. Nostalgia is comforting. Change can be frightening. We tend to romanticize the world that we knew when we were growing up, and for most Americans, that was a very different world. I'm part of a fading demographic. People in my generation grew up in the 50s and 60s. In memory, nearly everybody lived in a father's knows best or leave it to beaver world. Mom stayed home, dad went off to work, the neighborhood was safe, and nobody went hungry. What we saw on television and the movies was all people who looked and sounded like us. TV shows were either variety shows domestic comedies, or highly romanticized westerns, where the good guys always won and the bad guys were always punished. We all watched Walter Cronkite for our news. Idyllic, but only for part of the population. And then things began to change. The last 40 years have been a period of rapid change in the world and in the US. Spread of computers, rise of social media, the fragmentation of our sources of news. And along with all that, major changes in the composition of the US population. Let's start with some boring statistics. See, there's the professorial part. Between 1980 and 2020, the percentage of white Americans dropped from 80% to 60%. Black Americans stayed about the same at 11 or 12%, but the percentage of Hispanics grew from about 6% to nearly 20%, and Asian Americans increased from 2 to 6%. By the 2040s, white America will be a plurality, but not a majority. But these changes are uneven. Most of the growth of non-white Americans has occurred in urban areas, while most rural areas have changed only a little. Take, for instance, a mostly rural state of farms and small... Take Iowa, for instance, a mostly rural state of farms and small towns. I pick on Iowa because most of my family comes from there a generation or two back. Between 1980 and 2020, Iowa's white population dropped from 93% to 90%. Its African American population grew from 1.5% to 4%, while Hispanics grew from 4 to 6.5%, and Asian Americans went from 0.5% to 2.5%. For most Iowans, in other words, not very much has changed in terms of the people around them. On the other hand, look at our largely urban neighbor, California. From 1990 to 2020, the white population dropped from 57% to 38%. The Hispanic population rose from 26% to 40%. Asian population went from 10% to 16%, and the black population stayed about the same at 7%. In most of our large cities, white America is a minority. The black and Hispanic population dominates, and there is a significant Asian American population. Rural America is still mostly white. So what does all this mean for who we are as a nation today? Listening to the radio recently, I heard a commentator use a phrase that caught my attention. He said, "America is very good at one thing. America makes Americans." Stop to think about just what he meant by that. While we hear ad nauseum about our divisions and problems, what we don't hear very often is ways we are growing together. It's very easy to fall into despair, as Marcia noted in her sermon a few weeks ago. We are bombarded by news, most of it frightening or depressing. Our social media links seem to focus on the negatives all too often. We hear over and over about what is wrong with America, and indeed, there are very serious problems for us and for the world. Climate change, the destruction of vital environments, hunger, disease, war, closer to home, economic disparities, hunger, homelessness. I don't want to minimize any of these, but at the same time, I don't want to sound like Voltaire's Dr. Pangloss, that we're living in the best of all possible worlds. Far from it. But when we focus on the negatives, we sometimes forget to remember the positives. So I want to spend a few minutes this morning looking at some of them. What sort of people were we at the beginning, and what can that say about us today? Communities and nations usually take much of their character from the group of people who first settled there. The founding fathers, and they were all fathers, were white, Northern European, and dominantly Protestant. Even Maryland, founded by the Catholic Charles Calvert, Lord Baltimore, as a refuge for Catholics, never had a Catholic majority. And that WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant template, persisted through much of our history as a nation. It was assumed that as new immigrants arrived, they would take on the same character. The US would be a melting pot, and everyone would adopt that same WASP model. And that image of what America should be certainly persisted until well into the last century, and with a significant number even today. But that's not what happened, is it? True, immigrants arrived and adopted many features of the society they found. They learned English, they adopted clothing styles they saw around them, they adopted a belief in the rule of law and democratic systems, but they also kept something of who they were when they came. Their religion, traditional festivals, foods, music styles. And here's the wonderful part. Those features then spread into the rest of the population, over time eroding that WASP model of what America is. The Irish brought St. Patrick's Day, and now we all drink green beer in the middle of March every year. Cinco de Mayo, which is little noted in Mexico, has been celebrated by the Hispanic population of Southern California for over 150 years. Now the whole country celebrates it. You want a quick meal? Order a pizza. Jazz, rap music are characteristically American, coming out of our African American roots. Even our language. Certainly English is a common bond, but it is not the same as that spoken in England. It has sometimes been said we're two nations divided by a common language. American English is filled with elements brought here by immigrants, words and phrases from German, Spanish, Yiddish, words ultimately traced to African languages. The Great Awakening of the early 19th century brought the growth of distinctly American religious groups. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostal groups, distinctly American, not like the heritage of the Founding Fathers. Rather than a national church common in many countries, we recognize and cherish a great variety of religious forms, and increasingly, no religion. Consider our own denomination, very much an American institution. While always a small minority, Unitarian Universalists have since the mid-19th century played a leading role in many progressive movements, including abolition, votes for women, civil rights. Think about how often when we read about some prominent person, if their religion is listed, it's often Unitarian. People like Clara Barton, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Kurt Vonnegut, Pete Seeger, 5 US presidents, and Barack Obama, while not a Unitarian, was raised by Unitarian grandparents. Think about our music, how much it owes to our Black and Latin citizens. Jazz comes from a union of many traditions, and think of rap, hip-hop, country and western, bluegrass. Then there's what we eat. In the past, most Americans ate a rather bland diet. I grew up on Midwestern food. Meat, potatoes, gravy. Bread was tasteless white bread that could be wadded up into a ball of starch. Seasoning was pretty much limited to salt, pepper, and ketchup. There were regional variations, of course. Hot dish in the upper Midwest, grits and greens in the South, seafood along the coast. But immigrant groups brought their own culinary traditions to this country, and these traditions have spread and become part of all Americans' eating habits. Marina and I moved from California to Baltimore in the mid-1960s. We got so hungry for Mexican food that I even tried to make tortillas myself, a failed project. I finally found some tortillas canned in oil from Greece. 15 years later, after another stay in Maryland, my boys and I drove west and didn't see a Mexican restaurant until we got to Wichita, Kansas. We pulled in immediately. Now, Mexican restaurants are found everywhere, but most would be unrecognizable in Mexico. They have become American. The same can be said for Italian, or Thai, or Indian, or French, or Middle Eastern foods. The spice shelves in our supermarkets feature dozens of spices our grandmothers never heard of. We have become a distinctive American people, unlike any other in the world, and certainly unlike the Founding Fathers. I recently saw an article listing ways that Europeans can spot an American tourist. It's a long list. We wear baseball caps. We want ice in our water. Grown men wear shorts. We talk to strangers. We are a distinctive and unique people. We are not all the same, but consider the things we share, no matter where our ancestors came from. We are all Americans. America is very good at one thing. America makes Americans. So in spite of the differences, real as they are, tomorrow, let's celebrate all the things we have in common. And remember that we are a diverse but uniquely beautiful people. Be proud to be American. Celebrate.